Welcome back to another episode of Vivid Noise, and today's game is Serious Sam the Second Encounter, or really just Serious Sam in general. This is just the one that I feel like playing right now, but a lot of the stuff I'm going to say applies to the entire franchise, to be honest. My main point that I want to talk about for this video is the interesting dichotomy between a game's gameplay and the context within that the gameplay is placed within, and how seriously the game takes itself. You see, because Serious Sam, despite its name, doesn't take itself very seriously as far as the plot goes. I mean, the developers knew that they weren't going to be writing some epic story with stakes or whatever. No, it's just, hey, go kill some things, and it's fun. But the game itself, as a video game, takes itself incredibly seriously. That's the interesting thing. It's because it's really, really hard. For this video, as you can see by my health bar, I'm playing on the easy setting because I don't feel like doing 50 billion takes just to get through like 5 minutes of the stage without dying over and over again, because I don't think you want to be looking at the quick loading screen. I mean, it loads very quickly because it's an old game, but you get the idea. You don't want to be seeing that. As I was saying, this game does not mess around. Like, you have to know, exactly which weapon is most optimal against which groups and which combinations of enemies. It's almost genius in the way that the free-form, almost lack of intentional design by the developers makes these games extremely strategic. I almost want to call it an RTS shooter. RTSS. Oh, RTSS, like the thing that you use to limit your frame rate. But really though, it's like a real-time strategy shooter. It's insane because you can't just go in and just shoot stuff, because you will get overwhelmed and you won't be able to handle the horde, right? Because every single grouping of enemies has its own strategy that needs to be applied, and it changes depending on which groups of enemies are together. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Let's first address this just as a game. If you're not familiar somehow, even though I'm sure that, if you're at all interested in first-person shooters, you've heard of Serious Sam. Interestingly enough, I was never too exposed to Serious Sam as a child. I would occasionally run into the name itself on certain websites, but because early 2000s internet, the thumbnail sometimes wouldn't load, so all I would remember is the name Serious Sam. I had no idea what it was. It wasn't until, I decided, let's look it up. And yeah, it's a shooter with a very different approach. It's not some, everyone, I don't have to even say this anymore because Civi will tell you, and every other YouTuber will tell you. But this isn't the return to Quake. This isn't the return to Doom. It has some elements of it, and especially the fact that it does not focus on the cinematics or story whatsoever, but it really is its own sort of thing. The most common comparison is Smash TV, but I feel like it's a lot more than that, and it brings me back to the way the game works with the hordes, right, with the different kinds of enemies, and it plays on two levels. See, because this game, in a lot of ways, I feel like was just sort of I don't want to call it a glorified tech showcase, but it really did feel like Crow Team just saying like, hey, look at what we can do. We don't have the big budgets of the Americans, but we can still do cool stuff. Look at all our enemies on the screen. And that in of itself solidified this franchise's gameplay identity. Aside from that, the early games, despite their age, really do come with some incredibly impressive production values. Well, okay, that bit of popping you just saw there aside, the visuals are, they were incredibly impressive for their time, and thanks to their art direction and sometimes lack of art direction, because it's a bit of a mess, honestly. The enemy designs are just, they feel like they got their hands on some 3D modeling software and just said, okay, what can we do? Skeletons that are horses? Sure. Weird brains walking like robots? Like, okay, sure. Cheerleader flying thing? Yeah, that too. Okay. You know what I mean? It's a fucking mess, which is actually why I am playing the original right now, as you can see, because I'm a bit of a stickler for that. I think the HD remakes of the first two Serious Sam games, Serious Sam First Encounter, Second Encounter, they are one of the very few instances of an HD remake that does not lose anything in translation. Because oftentimes you get an HD remake which updates some elements of the art direction in the wrong way, and even if the game technically looks better, it doesn't actually look the same. It might still look good in its own right, but with Serious Sam, because there literally is no art direction to speak of, it's just a mess. Having a better looking version of that mess is, well, it's a net positive, really. I think a few of the character designs have been altered slightly, like those guys right there, the Cucurbitos, see if I can say it correctly, and the Zumbles, I think they're called, those weird pink dudes with like blasters that are really hard to avoid. Yeah, those guys too. But for the most part, it really is just they took the original models and just, made them look more, high def. I also feel like the sound design doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, you've got some fan favorites like Dunes or the Grand Citadel, I think it was called, which are absolute bangers. Like, I never realized how good the music is in these games. It's insane. It's so catchy. This game in particular, Serious Sam Second Encounter, actually has a couple metal tracks by this Croatian band Undercode, and I almost want to say that like their instrumentals are their best work because, I don't know, maybe it's just the inner Eastern European in me who cringes at Eastern European accents because I hear them all of the time in the real world. But when I listen to their vocal tracks, I'm like, oh boy, these guys they do not speak English, clearly. But their riffs are ridiculously good, and I love the production, seriously. But the ambient music in the game is also really good. I love the tribal drums and just the different textures and the way that it transforms when you got, enemies on the screen, which also serves a gameplay purpose because it instantly alerts you. It's like, if you can't see it, like those big green dudes, I think they're called Highlanders. I'm not entirely, that guy right there you're seeing on the screen. Hopefully it syncs up correctly. Those guys, they will usually blend in with the environment. They'll sort of hide, but the music will give them away. And lastly, when it comes to the sound design, one of the things that Crow Team did, which I feel was almost single-handedly the reason why this game performed as well as it did. I don't mean performance, I mean like it sold really well, other than the fact that it was just really solid and $20, but it became popular among a Western crowd despite its origin because, well, they got an actual native, like an English speaker, right? They got John J. Dick to do the voice acting. Because let me tell you, if a freaking Serious Sam, like if he had like that Eastern European accent, oh my god. It's funny though because a lot of the NPCs in the games will sound like that because clearly it's just Crow Team's devs or their friends or something. And that gives it a charm, right? It kind of reminds you like, hey, we're the small, not American studio, right? And I know it seems kind of harsh for me to say something like that, like, oh, no one's gonna like your game if you don't sound American, but it's a pretty big market, so, and the Eastern European sound doesn't exactly have the same sort of charm as, let's say, because you know how sometimes they'll intentionally have like Japanese sounding accents in games because that turns a lot of people on, I think, or French or the kind of accents that people like, or maybe I'm just biased because I hear it all the time in the real world, but other than that, yeah, that was a very smart move, though, hiring an American voice actor. And it's great. I honestly find him way more charming than Duke Nukem. As for why I sort of prefer the second encounter over the first one, even though the first one is iconic, absolutely, it's mainly the visual variety, really. The fact that you've got all these varied locations compared to just Egypt. Not to say that Serious Sam 1, the first encounter, doesn't have variety within that same location. It definitely does. In fact, that game has its own merits in its visuals because it's able to convey a lot of different vibes, like the overwhelming vastness of the dunes, or the really almost cozy kind of areas that you get with the lighting and stuff, especially in the HD remake, actually. And I just love the nighttime levels. There's this one level, I don't remember the level names, but there's this one where it's nighttime and there's a giant pool, and oh my god, that shit is gorgeous. I want to live there. You know what I mean? It looks amazing. And again, the ambient sound design and stuff, it really does create a great atmosphere and a great juxtaposition between the action that happens when you're actually in the heat of battle, right? Whereas here, a lot of the environments feel a little more, I guess, purpose-built, like you won't find yourself just sort of vibing in them. But I guess it does feel more climactic for a sequel, it's more dangerous, more exciting. And I think because of that, the second encounter is overall the more fulfilling experience, but honestly, nowadays the games are so damn cheap. I'd recommend you just get both. Like, really, just get both. The first and second encounter together. It could be either the classics or the HD remakes. Surprisingly enough, the classics still work perfectly fine on modern Windows 10 and 11 with modern GPUs. Seriously, like, no issues. It even specifically reads my GPU. It doesn't, because some older games will be patched with like these wrappers and stuff to pretend you're using an older card. No, in this game will literally point out the exact GPU model that I have, and that's definitely a rarity when it comes to games of this age. Although with the first encounter, I think it occasionally pops up like this GeForce 2 thing, which at that time the GeForce 2 was relevant, so maybe it's still doing some sort of internal reading thing, like it's maybe interpreting it differently. Whatever it is, it works really well, runs real smooth. It's got a billion graphic settings, so it's super scalable, but you don't really need it to be scalable anymore. It'll run on anything. So now I finally feel like I can get back into the point that I wanted to make about certain games taking their gameplay or their plot more seriously than the other, or maybe together, or maybe not at all. And so, like with Serious Sam here, the plot it doesn't exist. It's a fucking meme. It's a joke, right? I'm pretty sure Crow Team themselves just want to see how far they can go with the whole prequel thing, because like every game is apparently a prequel, and it's just, it doesn't take itself seriously at all. But the gameplay, unless you're playing on this difficulty that I am on right now, if you're playing on normal or anything higher, you're fucking dead, right? Like, it's difficult, and you have to know how to play the game well. You got to be able to manage the hordes, use the right weapons, navigate around the environments, find the secrets, all sorts of shit. It is not for the faint of heart. And that creates an interesting contrast, because there's so many games that are the exact opposite, that take their context, their stories so seriously, with cinematic cutscenes and big budget voice acting and everything's gray, and then the actual game will just be hold up to do this thing, and I know this game is mostly press S and mouse click 1, but it really isn't pressing S and mouse click 1. There's a lot of pressing A and D as well, let me tell you. But no, really, it's a lot more than that. But with a lot of AAA games, right, and not even just AAA games, you'll find a lot of pretentious ass indie games as well that are like that. Less common, but still. Another thing to point out is actually the lack of design, or the intentional design that goes into that sort of, whether or not the game can be taken seriously from a gameplay standpoint. Because you ever notice how there are certain games where the reason why you can't take their gameplay seriously isn't because they're intentionally designed that way. They're sort of like a more lighthearted game from a gameplay standpoint, but because they literally just aren't designed very well, so you just can't take them seriously because of that. It's just like, it's really easy to exploit, or the AI is ridiculously easy, or the game is just blatantly unfair, so you just don't even give it the time of day. Stuff like that. Like, you ever notice, I guess, really low-hanging fruit would be the modern Battlefield campaigns, right, where the newer ones don't even have campaigns, but when they did, it was like, you got these, angry stories in, World War or Modern Warfare, whatever it might be. Not talking about Call of Duty Modern Warfare, but that too. And then you got like the gameplay where, for example, I think it was Battlefield 1, the World War 1 game, where you have a plane that can just infinitely repair itself, because apparently magic existed in the early 1900s. And then you got the kind of games that are not even meant to be taken seriously by design. So like Goat Simulator, or I guess in a way Surgeon Simulator, though that one is far more polished. And are you noticing a trend? Yes, a lot of them have simulator in the title. Remember that trend in like the mid 2010s when every game was just like this fucking YouTuber bait simulator type thing? I'm so glad those have mostly died out. I'm sure that they're still being made to some capacity, but they're nowhere near as popular. Like your feed is not going to be full of, I don't know, foot simulator. You put on a pair of socks. I don't know. Oh boy, I can imagine a certain kind of crowd being very much into that kind of game. But I mean, we got Hand Simulator, right? Remember Grass Simulator? Yeah, I'd rather not remember Grass Simulator. But anyway, the last thing I wanted to sort of mix in here with this point that I wanted to make about, games taking themselves seriously, or, be it the presentation and the relationship between the presentation and the actual gameplay, would be why I think so many games go for one or the other and sort of try and create a contrast, right? So like a serious premise, but more lighthearted gameplay, or vice versa. It's because it's just more, I don't know, more exciting that way, even though it's very played out. So like the, those cutesy indie platformers that are actually very, very difficult, right? Or, the big budget games that present themselves as very serious, but they're usually just hold up to do this thing, right? Mash the button. And it makes sense. It all depends on the audience, right? For example, those cutesy indie platformers, they are marketed towards the people who, grew up playing games with that sort of art direction when they were kids, but now they want something that looks like that, but will actually challenge them as adults, right? Whereas more, popular, I guess, AAA type games, they are usually marketed towards people who, well, I want something that looks like, a movie, I guess, and doesn't require me to put in too much effort as far as the gameplay goes. I mean, some of them will straight up admit it, like they'll have the easy mode literally be called something like, I just want a story. And to be fair, this game kind of does it too. The easiest difficulty is called Tourist, which is totally valid because this game is fucking gorgeous environments. So honestly, just running through them on your own, just blasting shit without ever worrying about dying, that's still pretty enjoyable. But, obviously, you want some challenge, but not too much, because this game can be a little bit, I mean, sometimes I genuinely have no idea how they expect you to take care of, like, the amount of enemies on screen at once. I know it's possible, technically. They wouldn't put it in the game otherwise. I don't know, it's the kind of dedication that I don't think I have. Anyway, I want to just offset my last point by just mentioning that there are AAA games that do take themselves seriously in both aspects. Look at, the modern Doom games, right? Those games are not only very well presented and very polished and have a very, dark sort of, well, not dark story, because clearly the Doom guy, Doom Slayer, he does not give a shit about what's going on, but the game kind of, says, hey, look at these things, kind of care about them, but not too much. And the gameplay, on higher difficulties will, rip your ass open, because that's just what Doom's always been about. And on the more indie side of things, I'm not sure how indie exactly, because they've definitely got to have a pretty, sizable budget to make these kind of games. But Spin Tires, remember Spin Tires? The game with the really impressive mud deformation? It's not the only game to have that, but still, it was a pretty big deal back when it came out. I remember it when that came out. Like the tech demo, now I feel old, but that game actually has a very, down-to-earth, like serious kind of presentation. The colors are usually very muted. It does a pretty good job of presenting that, Russian Eastern sort of environment. And the gameplay is not, just some wacky arcade thing. Like, you got to manage fuel, manage your damage, of the vehicles. They can get stuck in mud, and you got to manage the diffs and tire pressure and all sorts of stuff. And they really do expect you to take your, I guess, job as a, driver of these kind of vehicles very seriously. And the presentation reflects that. So you've got that complementary relationship between the presentation and the gameplay. Coming back around to a point that I made in my Sonic Adventure DX video, actually, I don't blame you if you haven't seen it. It's pretty long. But I talked about how I found Serious Sam Free to be like very uncanny sort of looking, and you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it in this context, it might just be because unlike most other Serious Sam games, especially 2 and Next Encounter, when they got really cartoony, that game breaks, like Serious Sam Free, breaks that rule of having the over-the-top presentation and very punishing gameplay. It still has that punishing gameplay from what I can tell. I haven't played it yet. I don't really want to be honest, from what I've seen. But its presentation is, a lot more serious, pun intended or something. It's not realistic in the slightest, but it's not as colorful. Everything's trying to be all military and, because of the game's development and stuff. And Sam uses terms like Bravo Team, Recon, all those kind of modern military terms. Right? The game came out in 2011. That was the same year as Modern Warfare 3, right? And Battlefield 3 as well. So that was peak Spunk Gargle Wee Wee shooter. But that game isn't a Spunk Gargle Wee Wee shooter. It's still a classic sort of, Serious Sam type experience, but it has some things in it that don't really belong, like reloads. Like, why do you have to reload? I don't care if it's realistic. It doesn't make sense for the game. Whatever. So maybe that's why I felt sort of weird towards that game, because of its style in relation to the way that it plays. Thanks for sticking around for another episode of Vivid Noise. I'm going to keep these shorter for the time being, and I'll see you at the next one.